Plato, who lived in ancient Athens, is one of the four founders of political philosophy, and indeed philosophy in general. At the time in which he lived, ancient Athens was governed by a direct democracy. Now let's briefly pause to discuss precisely what this means. We're used to democracies now whereby we elect a representative who's normally a member of a political party, and then they go to Parliament or whatever other association or assembly and represent us. And we call this a representative democracy. In ancient Athens they had a direct democracy, meaning that every citizen went and represented themselves in the assembly. Now, very briefly, every citizen did not entail every person over the age of 18 as it does today. In order to be a citizen in ancient Athens, one had to be male immediately, one had to have been born in Athens, and one had to have a certain amount of money and therefore a certain amount of leisure time in order to ponder on matters political. All issues in ancient Athens was done by a vote of the citizens. Indeed, legal issues were done by a vote of all the citizens, and this is particularly where Plato developed his dislike of democracy, for it was in a vote of all the citizens that condemned Socrates, Plato's tutor, to death for corrupting the youth of Athens and worshipping false gods. It is here that we see the beginnings of Plato's dislike of democracy and how he began to criticize this democracy. One idea that Plato uses in this attack of democracy is what has become known as the craft analogy. Now, Plato says, imagine that one had to train a horse. To whom would one take the horse to be trained? Would you take it to the first person you met? Would you get a group of people and get them to vote on how you should train this horse? Or would you take it to an expert in horse training? Plato says that the training of mankind, or the leading of mankind, is just like training a horse in the sense that it should be done by an expert. Just as you have expert horse trainers, so you have people who are experts in leading mankind. These experts in leading mankind are the philosopher kings, and it is the philosopher kings that should govern. In a democracy, we choose how we want to be governed according to a vote of everybody concerned, or the citizens in Plato's ancient Athens. Plato says this is not a good way to discover truth and justice. It should be left to experts, the philosopher kings. The state, Plato argues, should be just like the individual, but writ large. What he means by that is this. Plato argues that each of us is divided into having three kinds of desires. He calls these appetite, spirit, and reason. Now, appetite is our desire for food, for water, but also for sex. Spirit is our desire for honour. And reason is, well, our desire for knowledge, an understanding of truths, for example. Now, Plato says that in a fully matured person, reason would dominate over spirit and appetite. Society is similar, Plato argues. You have different groups of people governed by different desires. You have groups of people who are governed by appetite, groups of people governed by spirit, and groups of people governed by reason. People who are governed by reason should dominate over the rest of society, just as reason should dominate in the individual. If one was dominated by spirit or appetite, you still have a role in society. People governed by spirit, for example, make excellent soldiers. People governed by appetites would be the farmers, the traders, and so on and so forth. People would have a place in society, but crucially, only those dominated by reason, the philosopher kings, should govern. This is not an equal society. Plato's political philosophy, but also his philosophy about truth, which I'll go on to describe later on, is summed up nicely in perhaps the most famous aspect of Plato's work, the analogy of the cave. Now here, Plato asks us to imagine that there is a cave, surprise, surprise, in which prisoners are facing a wall. They're tied up, they can't move, and they're just facing this wall. Now behind them is a fire, and in between the fire there is a footpath. Now what they see on the wall in front of them then is the shadows of the people and things moving past them on the footpath behind them. They come to accept the shadows in front of them as being reality. Now imagine one of these prisoners managed to get free from their shackles and run out of the cave to the light. Plato says first he'd be blinded by the light, he wouldn't know what he was seeing, but eventually he would realise that the shadows that he saw downstairs were not the reality, but what he saw around him was reality. His job then would be to go back into the cave and inform the other people of the nature of the truth. That is the role Plato saw for the philosopher king. It is the philosopher king who is able to lead the other prisoners, but crucially is the philosopher king who is able to know the truth, to distinguish between the reality and the shadows on the wall. Truth then plays an important role in Plato's political philosophy in at least two senses. Firstly, Plato is saying that his system of government is true. His form of government, with philosopher kings governing and everybody else having their place, is right. It is true. He's not saying that it's something that we can all agree upon in some sort of compromise. Neither is he saying that this sort of system is natural to humanity. What he's saying is that this is true. Other forms of government are wrong. If you disagree, you're wrong. Secondly, he's saying there is a discoverable by the philosopher kings, I hasten to add, a discoverable truth out there which is separate from the reality we see around us. Now, this is problematic because he's saying that philosopher kings have access to this truth, whereas other people don't. A lot of people, and specifically Karl Popper, say that this is the damaging aspect of Plato's political philosophy. It's the potential is here to have a totalitarian regime with a group of unelected individuals telling other people what the true nature of the world is. Now there's a problem with Plato's political philosophy here, isn't there? There's one group in society, the philosopher kings, who have access to the truth and have all the power in society to govern over everybody else. Now what's to stop these philosopher kings from just governing in their own interests and letting the rest of society starve? Now Plato addresses this in the Republic, and he says the way in which you stop philosopher kings from governing in their own interests is that you ensure that they have no interests. Right? And he does this by making them live in a semi-communist society with no private property, no houses of their own, no families of their own. Children will be brought up communally, and so on and so forth. And so they wouldn't be allowed to own things. So consequently, they cannot possibly govern in their own interests because they have no interests in which to govern. So instead, they must govern in the interests of all of society. Now bear this in mind when we go on later on to look at Rousseau, that this is a perpetual theme in Republican thought. How do you govern in everybody's interests rather than your own interests? This is Plato's argument.